Hello, everyone. It's Ruth. Today, we're going to be going over the basket coiling process. It's a really fun process that is a little tricky in the beginning, but feel free to pause or rewatch this video as often as you need. Once you get the hang of it and get into the rhythm, it really is a fun, relaxing, and enjoyable process. But coil baskets have a very, very long history, a very rich history. They've been made by indigenous peoples and cultures all over the world. It's a process that's been used for generations and a process that hasn't really changed much over the years. They're these intricately woven, bundled fibers that can have these beautiful patterns and colors. They can come with lids and handles and straps. They're used for holding herbs and medicines, breads, even coffee beans. But today, we're going to take part in this wonderful tradition and do a little basket coiling ourselves. Like I said, please feel free to pause or rewatch the video as often as you need. I know this can feel like a little tricky process, a little frustrating in the beginning, but once you get into the rhythm of the wrapping and coiling, it really is an enjoyable process. Let's talk for just a moment about some of the supplies that we need for today. As always, we'll start with our illustrated instructions. We're going to be doing number 11, basket coiling. As I said, this is a really great process. We're going to follow these instructions. I'm going to give you kind of hints along the way on how to do some of these coiling processes. But just like with all our illustrated instructions, it'll start off with a list of the supplies and then step by step, the process and how to do that. So go ahead and pull your illustrated instructions aside. We'll follow along with that. You'll also need the cording. We're going to be using some macrame cording today. That's the cording that was in your kit. We used a little bit when we were making our fabric wrap jewelry bracelet, and we're going to use the rest of it today. So go ahead and pull out that cording. Now, you can also bring in other things to use as cording. If you don't have the macrame cording, you can use rope, you can use clotheslines, you can use fabric that's been bundled up into a cord. There are quite a few things that you can use other than macrame cording. You really just need something to use as that core to wrap material around. So we're going to be using that macrame cording today, and we're going to be using the leftover yarn as our wrapping. So I've got leftover pieces of yarn from our weaving project, and I'm going to use the rest of mine today. So go ahead and pull out your yarn. Again, feel free to bring in other yarn that you have, other materials that you want to wrap with. Maybe you have a really pretty ribbon that you want to use. There's some leftover fabric strips. All of those are wonderful things to use to wrap the cording. But be creative. Feel free to bring in other items. You're also going to need your tapestry needle. Now I have a little pink one we've used a few times throughout this series, but go ahead and pull your tapestry needle out. We're going to be using it again today. You also may need a little bit of super glue. It's not necessary, but it does help in sometimes. Most likely we're not going to use it, but we're going to have it on hand just in case. So go ahead and pull that one out. Now there's a supply that we do need. We've needed in almost every project, but it's not in your kit. And that's going to be a pair of scissors. So go ahead and pull your scissors out. We're going to be using those today as well. Now, I wanted to show some examples right before we get started on what your little baskets could look like. We're going to be making some small ones. We're using that leftover cording. But again, if you use bigger cording, if you have a spool of the cording, you can make bigger baskets, taller baskets, wider baskets. The sky is the limit when it comes to how to adapt this process for sure. But you can see they're just kind of small baskets that are good for like holding like rings or keys, spare change, things like that. I think they're really cute. So we're going to set that aside. Okay, we're going to set that aside and we're going to start our process. So if we look at our illustrated instructions, that very first step has to do with that cording. So I'm going to set this here. I'm going to set my yarn and supplies aside, and I'm going to start with the end of that cording. Let me go ahead and open that up. So I've got the end of my cording here. It's a little frayed on the edge, but that's okay. And I'm going to start off with my blue yarn today. So I'm going to go ahead and open that up and lay that out too. So I've got my two bits that I'm going to work with side by side. My very first step, like it says in the illustrated instructions, is to get that cording at a diagonal. Now, the reason we're doing this is because we're wrapping it up on itself. And by making it small, we don't have that big bump. It'll work out in the long run, I promise. So we're going to do that at an angle. We'll start that. And we're going to take that little piece of yarn, the tail of the yarn, and we're going to put it together with that cording, line it up. Now, I'm right-handed, so I'm going to use my right hand to do a lot of the wrapping. I'm going to use my left hand, hold everything in place, right? So what we'll start off doing, I'm going to take with my left hand, I'm going to put the cording in the yarn in my hand, and I'm going to hold it in place with my thumb and my finger. Right. So what we're going to do is we're going to start wrapping that cording up to the tip. We're going to start where our left finger and thumb are and wrap it up. And you want about 2 inches, not a huge amount, just about 2 inches. So I'm going to hold my thumb, my left thumb and my left finger in place. And with my right hand, my dominant hand, I'm going to use the other side of the yarn. And I'm going to start wrapping that yarn around the tail of the yarn and the tail of the cording. Okay. So holding with my left hand, I'm holding that yarn and cording tightly. I'm going to take my right hand and wrap that cording around both of those pieces. Now we're doing this for a couple of reasons. We're starting off, we need to make a loop to start off with. So this is setting us up nicely for that loop. But the main reason we're doing this is so we don't have to do knots, right? We're going to be doing this to hold that yarn, the tail of the yarn together with the tail of that cording. And you can see as I'm wrapping, I'm moving my fingers up to hold it in place. And I'm just doing this. I'm moving it tightly so you can see there's no cording showing through, just wrapping it. It doesn't have to be a fast process. Let yourself slow down and kind of enjoy it too. So we're just doing that wrapping, that twisting, wrapping that yarn around that cording and the tail of the yarn. And as I'm wrapping, like I said, I'm moving my fingers up because I want to make sure I've got a good grip on it. I'm wrapping it nicely, right? So you can see so far where I started, I have this kind of little loop, and that's okay. It's okay if you have a little loop at the end. It's also okay if you don't, because the truth is this part is going to be covered up, so it doesn't matter what it looks like, right? This is just where we're kind of starting the beginning of our coiling process. So again, we're just kind of wrapping around that cording, and we're going to go till we get to that frayed part, that end, right? So you can see I have that tail end of the cording, that tail end of the yarn, and I've got it wrapped quite a way up, about 1.5 inches. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to take the cording and bend it in half, kind of bend it up to make a little loop. We can see in the illustrated instructions, that's our step 2, taking that cording, wrapping it, bending it in half, and then wrapping those 2 ends together. So what that looks like is having this cording, having that frayed edge at the end, and I'm bending it together so the cording is next to each other, right? The frayed edge is next to the cord. And what I'm going to start doing, I'm holding it again. I'm holding it together with my left hand, my left finger, my left thumb, holding those frayed edges down. And I'm going to take the rest of the yarn, and with my right hand, my dominant hand, I'm going to wrap those 2 ends together. And again, this is probably the trickiest part. And you can see I'm wrapping. I have that little loop, and I'm wrapping the frayed end with the rest of the cording. And we're just doing it kind of tightly, right? Wrapping it up. And this is the trickiest part, I think, doing this beginning, especially with frayed edges. But we're just kind of wrapping it together. We're doing it tightly because we don't want to see that cording come through. But at the same time, we're going to be gentle with ourselves. And so if we do have some little pieces sticking out like I do, I'm going to be forgiving and know that's okay. This is my first time doing it, right? One of the beginning projects. I know I have some strength issues in my hand, so I can't get things as tight as I would like them, but getting them as tight as I can get them is what's important, right? So again, we're just kind of wrapping it up, wrapping those ends together, wrapping that frayed end, the tail of the yarn, wrapping them all together, and just kind of wrapping it up. Right. And as I'm wrapping it tightly, I'm moving my left hand down So my right hand, my dominant hand, can wrap all the ends together. So I have the little loop, I have it wrapped together, and I've started doing that cording. Now, if we look at our illustrated instructions, it tells us our next step is to wrap it in that E shape. We're going to look for that lowercase e shape, and we're going to thread those ends together. This is the very beginning of that coiling process that we're doing, right? And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to take the end of the tail end of the yarn, and I'm going to thread it through my tapestry needle, right? Our tapestry needle is going to come in handy. So we're taking that tapestry needle, I'm taking the loop shape, and I'm going to twist it up on itself, right? So this is that very beginning. We're starting that coiling process, right? And so I'm going to take my tapestry needle, I've bent it into that E shaped. I'm going to take the tapestry needle. I'm using my left hand now, my less dominant hand, to hold it together. And I'm going to take that tapestry needle and thread it through that center loop, right? That center loop that we're curling up to make that E shaped. And I'm going to thread it through. And what this is doing is holding that together. We're starting the very bottom of our coiled basket. And I'm going to thread it through that center loop about 3 times. 2, 3. Again, in the image, it's ideal for it to be close, but we're adapting it to work for us. Like I said, I have some strength issues in my hand, so I can't get it as tight as I would like, but I can adapt it and get it as tight as I can, right? So I've wrapped it 3 times, threaded it through 3 times, and so I'll do some more wrapping. Now remember, I'm holding the cording. I was standing on the cording. I'm holding the cording with my left hand, right? My left finger, my left thumb. And so I'm going to take my right hand again, and I'm going to start that wrapping process. Now I'm wrapping it around that cording, right? We're going to wrap it about 1 inch. Remember, making it as tight as we can. Like I said, this is the trickiest project or part of the project, doing that starting point. But once you get that down, it's that same process over and over again. So your body is going to remember that wrapping, that threading, that wrapping, that threading. It's that same process, that same movement. And we're going to do that all the way through making our basket. This is that process that I was talking about that these cultures have been doing for generations. It hasn't changed much. So no matter what material you're using, you're doing that same process, that wrapping, that threading through, that wrapping, that threading through. And so we're going to wrap it about 1 inch down. And then we're going to do that again. We're going to thread it through. So I'm bending that around. See? So I did that first coil. I made that E shape, and I'm going to keep bending it around and threading it through the nearest gap, right? And so we're doing this to keep it in place. Do it about 3 times. 2, 3. Right? And so now it's starting to coil up. We can start to see that coil start to form, right? So you can see I'm getting towards the end of my thread. I'm going to kind of keep going with this one and show you how to change threads. Now, if you're using the thread that came in the kit, it's already going to be down to size. You want something that's cut a little short so it's easier to manage. If you're bringing in your own yarn, you know, a skein of yarn has quite a bit of yarn in it, but it can be a little difficult to maneuver. So cutting it down to like 1 yard or 2 yards is going to be a little easier to manage. You can even make it a little shorter than that, because this process of changing out thread is somewhat easy. So you can do it quite often throughout. We're doing it a certain way to keep out the knots. So it'll be a nice smooth basket instead of a basket that's filled with those knots. So again, a smaller piece is better to work with, and transitioning to a different thread isn't as bad a transition. And so you'll be able to do that multiple times. So I've threaded it through, I've looped that coil. So I'm going to do some more wrapping. Now remember, when I'm doing the wrapping, I'm holding it with my less dominant hand, and with my dominant hand, I'm doing the cording, the wrapping the cording. So I'm going to wrap it around a few times. And so I have that little tail, right? That little tail. So I'm going to take some more yarn. I have a green one here. I think a green will be really easy to see on the white paper. And so I have that tail. I'm going to put it down with the cording, the old yarn, straight down beside the cording. And the new yarn, I'm going to do the same thing. I'm going to put it straight down by that cording. Okay. So when I'm holding it with my left hand, remember my left dominant hand is holding everything in place. It's going to be holding both the tails of yarn and that cording. Okay. And with my finger and my thumb on my left hand, I'm holding it all in place, both the tails and the cording. And then with the rest of the yarn, I'm going to start wrapping. And so you're wrapping up, you see I'm doing that wrapping process. I'm wrapping up those two tails and the cording. It's all getting wrapped together. And so what this is doing is holding it in place so we don't have to use knots. Sometimes it helps to use just a tiny bit of super glue to hold it in place. You don't have to, but you can if you want to. But you're just going to do that wrapping. I'm going to go about an inch or an inch and a half, somewhere in there. And I'm going to do that same thing. I'm going to coil it up again and loop it. So I'm going to take the end of my new yarn and thread it through my tapestry needle. Okay. And so now that I'm like wrapping them up together, wrapping those tails onto the cording, and I've wrapped about an inch of my new yarn, I'm going to coil it up and connect it, thread it through the closest loop. So the center loop, we had been threading everything through, and that's good to start with. But once our basket starts getting more and more layers, you're not going to keep going back to that center loop. You're going to thread in to the closest gap, right? So this is my center loop here, but I'm going to thread it into this gap right here, right? And so I'm going to do that. I'm going to thread it through. And it's going to hold it. It's going to hold it together for me, right? With my left hand, I'm starting to hold it in place, right? And with my right hand, I'm threading that tapestry needle through, and I'm going to do it about, I'm going to do it about 3 times. So you'll see 3 layers. So there's 1, 2, and 3. So we've changed threads. It was pretty easy. We held the tails together and started wrapping, right? And again, if you need to look at that again, please feel free to rewind or pause. The great thing about doing this process is because we don't have any knots, we're not tying knots, we can easily take the thread out and start over again or redo it, right? And so it kind of takes some of the pressure off, right? So once we thread it through 3 times, about 3 times. It doesn't have to be 3, but 3 is a good number. You don't want to do less than 3, right? So we're doing those 3 times. We're going to take that yarn again, and we're going to start wrapping it around the cording and those tails again. So see, we thread it through the nearest gap, and I'm still wrapping up those 2 tails and that cording. It's holding it in place and keeping it secure, so we don't have to do those knots, right? We've made a smooth, somewhat smooth transition. And so we'll keep doing that. Keep wrapping. Keep wrapping. We'll go about an inch, just like before, and then we'll take our tapestry needle. We're going to pull that coil together, right? And pull it, again, as tight as we can, laying it down. And then with the tapestry needle, we're going to go in that closest gap, which for this time happens to be that same hole, that same gap. And we're just going to thread it through about 3 times. 3 is a good number. It's funny, you see 3 quite often in art. If you look at like paintings and things like that, the number 3 is a very important one. But anyway, that's a whole nother discussion. We're focused on basket weaving today. So we threaded it through about 3 times, and we're going to start coiling again. So coiling it, wrapping it around that cording, wrapping it around those tails, wrapping up the tails, the new yarn, the old yarn, wrapping it around the cording. We're going to go about an inch and a half, and then we're going to coil it and thread it through. Now you can see we're going to a different gap this time, right? With my left hand, I'm holding it in place. And with my right hand, I'm going to thread it through that nearest gap, not the center hole, right? My left hand is holding it in place, my non-dominant hand, less dominant hand. And with my dominant hand, I'm threading it through. And we're going to do it about 3 times, right? 3 wrappings. 2. So we have the 3 wraps, 1, 2, 3. And we're going to start coiling again, wrapping it around that cording again. And we're just going to keep doing this process. Right. And so you can see a little easier now that it's 2 colors. It's not always going into that center hole. This is that center hole that we started with. We made that E shape, and then we're just kind of wrapping it around. And you can see that what we're threading it through is going through the closest gap. It's not always the same gap or the same hole, but it's going through the closest one, right? So we're going to keep doing that, keep wrapping. We're going to make our bottom. Now I'm going to change this one out because the next thing I want to show us is how to start building up the sides of our basket. So I'm going to pull out my next piece that I've started. And you can see I've got a nice bottom to my basket here. And so let me thread the end of my cording or my yarn. And so you see I've got a good kind of bottom, a good base, and I'm going to start building it up now. So with what I have the 3 threading through the closest one. I'm going to do some wrapping real quick. And I'm just going to wrap it around. Again, with my less dominant hand, I'm holding the cording. With my dominant hand, I'm doing the wrapping. Wrapping it around a few times, going about an inch and a half. And you see I'm doing it kind of tightly because I don't want any of that cording to go through. But again, it's okay if it does. And we're just going to wrap a little bit. Okay. So now I've got my cording wrapped a little bit. I'm going to start building the walls up, right? And so what I'm going to do, you can see when I've been doing the cording before and wrapping the cording, threading the cording through, I've been laying the layers next to each other. But to start building up, I'm going to put my new layer on top of the layer before. So it's going to start going to 2 layers instead of 1. And so what I'm going to do, I'm going to put it on top and I'm going to start threading that through, right? And with my left hand, my less dominant hand, I'm going to kind of hold it in place and thread it through about 3 times. And then do 1 more. Right. Okay. So see, I've got my flat bottom and it's starting to layer up on top, right? So I've got the 2 layers. So what I'm going to do, I'm going to continue on that same process, but I'm going to be stacking them instead of putting them side by side, right? So let's start wrapping again. one, just wrap it around a few times, right? Go about an inch or an inch and a half. And this is the process that we're going to just be repeating. There's nothing fancy. That's it. It's that wrapping and threading through, wrapping and threading through. I know I feel it's a little redundant to keep saying that, but that's it. That's the process. And so it's kind of nice that it's not super involved. There's not a whole lot of different type of steps. So once you get into that rhythm, you're good to go. So we're going to start wrapping. I'm getting to the place where I'm ready to thread. So again, instead of putting it beside, I'm going to put it on top. And with my tapestry needle, I'm going to thread it through, right? And I'm going to thread it through about 3 times. Oh, to thread it through, we have to make sure that the yarn does stay in the in the needle. Okay, so now you can see it was one layer. We're gradually starting to pack it on top, right? And so I'm getting towards the end again, right? So I'm going to start winding up. I'm going to get ready to add in a new color. And it's that same process we did when we were changing the threads or the yarn earlier when I went from the blue to the green. We're just going to wrap it a little bit. And I'm going to put the tail with the cording. And then I'm going to get my new yarn. Open it up. And I'm going to do that same thing. I'm going to put the 2 tails of the yarn together next to that cording. And so with my less dominant hand, I'm going to hold all the cording and the yarn together. And with my dominant hand, I'm going to start that wrapping. And so what I'm doing, again, is that process of wrapping up the 2 tails together so we don't have to tie a knot. And we're putting those tails against the cording so it's holding it really secure for us. And so you'll start doing that kind of wrapping again. Do a little bit. And then when you're ready to thread it through, you'll take the end of the yarn, thread it through that tapestry needle. Okay. And we're going to do that same process of threading it through. So remember, we're doing it on top. We're going to follow that through and do it on top. And so I'm going to thread it through. We're not doing it beside anymore. We don't have a massive piece of the cording, so we can't do a larger basket. We're doing just kind of a small one to kind of practice and get used to it today. But I'm going to thread it through about 3 times. Remember, 3 was our good go-to number. Right. So you can see the sides of my basket are starting to grow. We went from that one layer to doing it on top, right? And so then with my new yarn, I'm going to still start wrapping that cording. I'm wrapping the tails of the yarn together. I'm wrapping the tails of the yarn to that cording. I'm just wrapping that yarn around it, right? We're going to go about an inch-ish. And I'm holding it. I'm holding all the pieces with my left hand, my less dominant hand. And with my dominant hand, I'm doing the wrapping, right? I'm doing the tricky part with my dominant hand. And then as you get an inch, about an inch, with your left hand, you'll hold it down again. And you'll take that tapestry needle and that thread, that yarn, and you're going to thread it through. Now remember, you're just going with the closest gap. It's not going into that center gap. We stopped that in the beginning. We're just going to that closest gap. Okay. So see, it's just going to that center gap. Now I'll show you with this one. It may be a little easier to see with this color one, but you can see the sides on the sides of this this basket here. When we do that threading it through, it's only going over 2 of those cordings, see? And it's going over whatever gap is closest. Does that make sense? Only going over, it's basically tying 2 of the cordings together. Right? All right, so just keep that process, keep doing that wrapping around the cording, threading it through, wrapping around the cording, threading it through. So the next thing I want to talk about is ending it, right? And so this can be a little tricky. This is also a place you may need the super glue, but I'm going to show you how to do it without the super glue. Super glue is nice because it does help secure it, but the way we're going to end it will be fine. So let's say you're like me and you get to the end of your basket. You have just a tiny bit of cording left, right? So what we're going to want to do, we have the rest of our yarn. We have the rest of our cording is used up. We're going to take the scissors and we're going to cut it at kind of an angle. We're wrapping it on itself. And so this way it'll be a smooth transition and it won't be a harsh gap, right? And so what I'm going to do is with the rest of my yarn, I'm going to put in the tapestry needle. There we go. And remember, we've been threading it through about 3 times, sorry, threading it through 3 times. And so you can kind of see in my basket here, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3. When we get to the end, we're going to keep threading it through until the cording is all covered up, right? And so I'm going to take my yarn. I've got the cording here. With my left hand, I'm going to hold it together, right? Hold the basket in place. And with my right hand, I'm going to start threading it around, right? And just threading it around. And we're going to do that till we get to the end, until all that cording gets covered up. Yep. So you can see I've got some layers that are all getting covered up. That's my goal, right? Covering up that little bit, those frayed edges, and trying to make it as tight as we can make it. And see how it's lining up, but it's also covering up those frayed edges. And we'll just keep threading it through. And covering up the end of that cording. Got a little too excited with that one. There we go. Okay, I'm almost done. I'm going to finish it off. Keep going through, keep wrapping it around until that cording is covered. Remember, this is the same way, basically, that we were trading thread out, right? Where we were connecting, not the thread, the yarn, trading the yarn out and connecting that yarn with the cording, fixing it secure just by doing that wrapping. Okay. You can see I've covered up those ends. So the last thing to kind of finish it off, I've got my loop. I'm doing it one more time. I'm going to thread through that loop and make it kind of tight. Okay. And then what I'm going to do on the inside is kind of thread it through the closest 3 that we've threaded it through. Pull that through. I've got it nice and tight, and so I'm going to trim it. Now this is where sometimes that little super glue comes in handy, because where I threaded that through, I'll just do a little drop of that super glue, and that's going to hold it in place for me. And we have our nice little basket. As always, if you have any questions, please feel free to reach out either by our contact@mather.com or by reaching out to us through Facebook.